Hello and good evening, everybody. It's me, Julian. Today I would like to talk about a movie that I very much enjoyed, titled Friendship, starring Tim Robinson and Paul Rudd. It's a film that explores what you might call male loneliness, the desire for masculine connections, the fear of emasculation, and the pitfalls, or if you will, the vicissitudes of adult male friendships, which is a long way of saying that this is a film about two men who enter into a friendship that goes horribly awry with devastating consequences for both of them. It's a unique blend of genres. It contains Tim Robinson's unique cringe comedy with certain existential thriller-like elements. The film can be very dark, it can be very funny, it can be dark and funny at the same time. It's very much an A24 film. What I mean by that is that it has certain stylistic features that blend what on the one hand appear to be a horror film with a comedy that contains slapstick elements, sort of 1970s style jazz fusion mystical music. It's a film that is both very tight, but in so doing contains an enormous amount of ideas. It's essentially an idea-driven film, and a very enjoyable one at that. And so what I'd like to propose here, if you have the time, is that I would like to briefly talk about some of the central themes of this film that I thought were very interesting and very well executed. I should say before I begin that perhaps my only criticism of the film is that I would have wanted it to be a little bit more extreme. I feel like it could have explored some even more difficult consequences for its characters. It could have driven the film into an even darker place. But perhaps that's more indicative of my own morbid leanings than anything else. I should say that this film is at its best when it encourages us not to laugh at the men, but to laugh with them. Which is to say, the intent of this film is never simply to mock its characters. Instead, it's quite earnest. It really sympathizes with them. And in so doing, I think it grants the audience an opportunity to reflect upon masculine identity and the way in which there is a genuine yearning, I believe, amongst men for male friendships, purpose, meaning, identity, what have you. In fact, the character that we're introduced to, Tim Robinson, is a relatively disaffected, somewhat awkward, alienated man who feels like he is failing, both to his partner. He cannot save her. She's being diagnosed with a cancer treatment, and even though it is in remission, it could come back at any time. This signals a certain impotence in him, as he can do very little for her. Indeed, they are moving out of their house. He also cannot fully empathize with her. But it also is that even though he is a relatively or moderately successful suburban husband, he cannot fully identify with his own success or his own enjoyment. He has everything figured out, but he really struggles to feel like he fits in. He's an inherently awkward social individual. He works in middle management for a consulting firm that helps social media companies create more addictive apps, what he explains as habit-forming mechanisms. And one day he encounters a man who appears to be, to him at least, the ideal man. A man who is comfortable with himself, who fully embraces his masculine identity. And this character is played by Paul Rudd. He is a weatherman who plays in a band, who goes foraging for mushrooms because he's connected to his inner caveman. In fact, there's a wonderful scene where the two characters bond over a supposedly ancient totemic artifact, a sort of axe head that Paul Rudd has ordered on the internet that symbolizes sort of time-defying, age-spanning masculinity. The music swells wonderfully in a sort of pseudo-jazz fusion, mystical Zen way that's very characteristic of A24 films, reminiscent, for example, of Uncut Gems, another wonderful film. And so Paul Rudd appears as this perfect man, this archetype, the specimen. He's charismatic, he's good looking, he seemingly has everything figured out. And yet, where the film is so wonderfully observant is that it allows us to see that Paul Rudd himself is lonely, that he himself doesn't have anything figured out. He's searching for things that signify back to him his own happiness. And here we have two men essentially coming together in male friendship, both wanting to prove to each other that they have something which is elusive to them, namely their own masculine identity. Tim Robinson projects ideal masculine identity onto Paul Rudd so that he himself can access it. He tries to imitate Paul Rudd. He treats him as a master figure. Indeed, one of the disappointments, indeed betrayals of this relationship occurs when Tim Robinson, hearing that Paul Rudd supposedly does not have a phone, refuses to use a phone himself. And then he realizes later that Paul Rudd had a phone all along, that his posture of being someone who was in touch with nature and who didn't want a technological device close to his genitals, etc., that this was all a facade. In other words, Tim Robinson imposes upon Paul Rudd a certain ideal fantasy frame of what it means to be a perfect man, which he therefore wishes to emulate. It gives him a license to be a man himself. Therefore, he overcomes his own fear of emasculation by means of projecting onto Paul Rudd the sort of ideal masculine identity. And for example, if you look at James Bond, like the James Bond films, which I very much like, we can see a similar mechanism. James Bond's license to kill is really a license to access masculine enjoyment. He gets to travel and spend money and do his duty, protecting his nation, sleeping with random women. Like, the whole fantasy of James Bond is a license to enjoy. Indeed, it goes back to the masculine problem, which is how to be a real man. There's a wonderful, one of my favorite British television series titled Peep Show, which is very similar in many ways to Friendship, has a certain scene in which the main character looks in the mirror and tries to say, "You are the man." And he gets it wrong. He keeps saying, "You are a man, you are a man." And he needs his friend to say, "No, you are the man." And so anyway, these two men come together. Paul Rudd himself is imperfect. Tim Robinson is imperfect. Tim Robinson increasingly creates this idealized version of Paul Rudd and essentially starts stalking him to a certain extent. He wants to know how Paul Rudd lives. He wants to fully crawl into his existence, going so far as breaking into his home, finding his beautifully satirically pathetic wood enamel box that says, "For when the tough time comes," that contains a gold enameled gun in it, and then stealing this weapon, putting it in his trousers, and inadvertently taking it back home with him. Here we have Chekhov's gun. Once the gun is introduced in the film, it definitely comes back in the third act, but I will not spoil how that occurs. But the film also explores male solidarity. In fact, one of the most wonderful scenes towards the end is, even when their friendship is falling apart, Tim Robinson realizes that Paul Rudd has been secretly balding, and he sort of manages to help Paul Rudd hide this from his friends and his peers, etc. Which, to say, once again, one of the things I liked about this film is that it shows these men at their most vulnerable, at their most pathetic. It fully exposes their vanities and their insecurities, but it always does so in a way that suggests a certain redemptive possibility that amidst this hysteria of the male fear of emasculation, there can be some form of kinship, that there is a certain friendship that remains possible. Lacan, in his psychoanalytic theories, already pointed out that the very desire to be considered a man always contains within it its very undoing, which to say, the more performatively the man tries to prove to other men and to himself that he is a real man, the more it becomes a theatrical performance, the more it can be undermined by those who laugh at it, who expose it for what it is, a certain charade, a farce. Indeed, there is something farcical in this idea of the man who has to prove to himself and to others that he is a true man. And yet the film, as I said before, never encourages us to laugh at the men, but to laugh with them. And so what I think makes this movie idea-driven fundamentally is that it says there is a problem here. Not just a problem of masculine identity, but a certain masculine and male loneliness and a desire for meaningful friendships. And instead of simply creating a bromance comedy in which two men find each other and get to become children again, in which they revel in their adventures and battles, the film actually undermines and deconstructs the very desire that men have to project their own fantasies of masculinity onto each other. And perhaps this is one of the underemphasized aspects of the infamous male gaze, which is that the male gaze isn't just something that is subjected, that men subject onto women, but in a sense they subject onto each other. They perform their masculinity for each other. In fact, many men, and when they act in masculine ways and tough ways, etc., are doing it to impress each other. In fact, this is where it's worth mentioning that Kate Mara, who plays Tim Robinson's wife, and she's absolutely wonderful in this film, actually emerges almost as like this indecipherable being who's always a disconcerting presence for Tim Robinson. He never knows exactly what she's feeling, what she's thinking, what she wants, the famed Freudian Was will das Weib, what does a woman want? He doesn't know if other men are attracted to her, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Her very presence becomes a constant indicator, an embodiment of a certain fundamental antagonism that exists within himself, which carries the name of masculinity. And therefore, the movie never says, oh, men are toxic or men are misogynistic. Instead, it points out how the very presence of Kate Mara, which is the object of his love, he genuinely loves her, creates within him a fear of emasculation. Indeed, one of the central scenes in the film, in the very beginning, is that Paul Rudd takes Tim Robinson on an adventure, the classic bromance plot device, if you will, climbing into a sewer so as to secretly sneak into City Hall. And Tim Robinson then attempts to repeat this very gesture as a heroic one with his wife, namely that she should accompany him on an impulsive adventure so that they can both find themselves. And yet this, mild spoilers for the film, this of course is doomed to fail. She disappears into the sewers. He loses her in the scene for the second time. First, because he cannot access her enjoyment. Secondly, because he cannot bring her any enjoyment. He cannot be the one who essentially liberates her in the way that he wants her to be liberated. And there's a very interesting scene towards the end where when she's being rescued from the sewer, she confronts him and she says, when I was alone in the sewer and I was lost and the lights were out, I experienced an orgasm. It's such an odd and yet really telling scene in the movie. It's cringe and comedic and awkward because he doesn't know how to respond, but it really points towards, I think, a deeper problematic that the film is aiming at, which is the mystery of female enjoyment, at least the mystery of female identity to Tim Robinson, and the extent to which it is an idea that threatens, that seems to eradicate him. In other words, she finds pleasure, she finds self-identity trapped in this maze underground in the dark, and the realization that she has in this coming to herself, quite literally, is that she wants to leave him. It's a devastating scene, it's a funny scene, it's a perfect example of how this movie manages to walk that dual line between comedy and despair, between horror and slapstick. It's so exquisitely crafted that it's really just, like, from a screenwriting perspective, really phenomenally well done. There are certain scenes here that I don't have time to fully explore in which Tim Robinson encounters other men who also seem lost in their own way. Perhaps one might even go as far as saying a little bit broken. You could say one of the subtitles of this film is, "Are the men okay?" To which the answer would be, well, they don't even really know what it means to be okay. It's a film that explores men who are good men, who are nice guys, as it were, who nevertheless find themselves trapped in the pitfall of masculine identity. Which is to say, it's not as easy as saying that it's about being either a toxic male or a non-toxic male. This very binary doesn't really work. The film completely undermines this idea. First of all, it's important to note that often the worst acts of misogynistic male behavior come from the seemingly nice guys, the ones who want to think of themselves as the good men. But vice versa, the film isn't interested in indicting men as being either good or bad. Instead, it's specifically interested in the filial relationship between and amongst men that both grants them access to their supposed masculine identity, and yet in so doing creates the conditions by which it can be undermined. Which is to say that this is a film that is fundamentally about male subjectivity, about access to male or masculine enjoyment. And at this point, you might ask, understandably, well, what is so special about masculine enjoyment? How can it not simply be universalized? Why does it have to be discussed in this way? And I think the answer to that, without going into any type of academic or psychoanalytic jargon, is that what the film essentially does is that it says that part of the male fantasy is precisely the belief that other men are real men, that other men somehow have access to some libidinal essence that marks them as being sort of homogeneous beings with a self-congruent identity. And that this very belief, this desire to be with men, amongst men, so as to be a real man, is itself a fantasy that is fraught with multiple psychological consequences. And here I think you can see, for example, why certain films like Fight Club remain so relevant today, because they are able to address alienation, male disaffection, the process of finding a certain masculine identity as both a resistance and, if you will, an integration into society. But what this film does is that instead of providing the audience with a sort of somewhat ideologically suspicious narrative of how to be a true man, it essentially posits that there is no such thing as a true man. That therefore the question of what it means to be a good husband, a good partner, a good father, a good man, a good person is something which can never be simply answered. And that perhaps the more one tries to do this, the more one ends up in trouble. Now, I'm not going to spoil how this film ends, but it is quite delightful. That is all I will say. It's a commedia dell'arte in which the characters have contradicting desires that lead them into clash with each other. I will end with one sequence that I particularly enjoyed, in which Tim Robinson, in sort of a not very good moment, decides that he wants to have an experiment with a psychedelic toad. He is interested in this because he has broken into Paul Rudd's house and found a book on ayahuasca, sort of a wink or a nod towards the growing infatuation with these types of drugs and spiritual remedies within the so-called manosphere. And he goes to this phone store, and he is offered by the young clerk who works there that he can lick the toad. And if he licks the toad, it will send him into a death and a rebirth, a spiritual journey. And he licks the toad, and the person holding the toad says, "Wow, that was such a big lick," to which Tim Robinson immediately goes into hysterics saying, "Did I lick the toad too much?" etc. And I think that in this moment, I won't reveal what his actual trip is like because it's very entertaining as well. I will just say it's very anticlimactic in the best way possible. In this moment of kinship, if you will, between a man who is holding a toad and another man who is licking it, asking if he has licked the toad correctly, we have, to my mind, the essence of this film. The beautiful, satirical, existential comedy, which is friendship. I really do hope that you'll take a look at this film. I think it's quite interesting, and I think it's another strong entry in A24's cinematic canon. That is Friendship, starring Tim Robinson and Paul Rudd. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to these ruminations on the film. And if you'd like to access more of my work, please do consider taking a look at my Patreon. See you soon.